In the beginning, there was only silence and torchlight. A circle of knights stood cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden beneath white hoods marked with a crimson cross. In the center, a single figure knelt on cold stone, trembling as he awaited the words that would bind him to eternity. The air was heavy with incense and iron. A chalice glimmered faintly, its contents dark, not from wine, but from something older, something forbidden. He had come to give up his life to God. What he didn't yet understand was that he was also surrendering his soul to something that lived beneath the church's light. This was the initiation of a Knight Templar. Not the sanitized version recorded in church chronicles or whispered by priests, but the one spoken of only in rumors, the ritual that gave birth to one of history's most feared brotherhoods. Every vow taken that night was a fracture between faith and fear. As the novice swore loyalty, obedience, and secrecy, the order swallowed him whole. He became property of the temple, bound not only by God but by the blood oath whispered in languages the church had long tried to forget. The blade that had spilled the blood of countless Saracens now nicked his flesh, a symbolic wound that made him reborn, half monk, half weapon. Outside, Christendom was a sea of war and sin. The Crusades had turned the Holy Land into a graveyard of faith, and amidst the chaos, the Templars rose as the Church's most devoted soldiers. To the world, they were the purest defenders of God's will. But in private chambers like this, the line between sacred and profane blurred into something no bishop dared to name. The Church saw only knights in armor. It never saw the rituals that baptized them in fear. The Templars had learned early that secrecy was their most powerful weapon. Every oath, every rite, was buried beneath layers of silence. To speak of it was to die. And yet, the deeper the secrecy, the stronger the brotherhood became. It was not just a military order, it was a covenant sealed in shadow. Blood, breath, and silence were the three pillars that sustained it. To break one was to betray all. But in the centuries that followed, these same vows would become the foundation of their destruction. When the Church turned against them, these oaths, once holy, would be recast as heretical. The blood that once marked their devotion would be called unholy, and the silence that once protected them would be used as proof of guilt. What began as faith would be rewritten as blasphemy. The camera of history lingers now on that first drop of blood on stone. It falls, glistening in the candlelight, disappearing into cracks that seem to drink it willingly. The kneeling man repeats his vow, to obey, to conceal, to die before betrayal. He does not yet know that this same vow will one day lead him to the pyre, accused of worshipping devils and desecrating the cross. The oath he swore before God will be the very reason the Church condemns him as an enemy of heaven. Every great secret begins with devotion. Every forbidden truth begins with faith. The story of the Knights Templar is not merely a tale of war or wealth. It is a story of faith twisted by power, of loyalty that outlived its masters, of silence that became louder than confession. As the last flame of the initiation torch flickers out, one thing becomes clear. The darkness the Templars entered that night was not just the absence of light. It was the beginning of a secret so deep, the Church itself would spend centuries trying to bury it, and fail. Because oaths made in blood do not die. They sleep. And sometimes, when the world grows quiet enough, you can still hear them whisper. They began not as conquerors, but as protectors, humble men who swore to defend the pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. In the ruins of the First Crusade, the Holy Land was a trembling scar, torn between salvation and slaughter. Out of this chaos, a handful of knights took an oath before God, to live without wealth, without women, and without fear. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. No banners, no crowns, no armies, just faith, steel, and the dust of the road beneath their knees. Yet from this poverty, an empire was about to be born. Their first home was not a castle but the stables beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple, a sacred ground already haunted by centuries of blood. It was there, in those stone corridors, that the Templars found both their name and their destiny. They believed they were living upon holy ground, the very center of God's promise. To protect pilgrims, they shed their humanity piece by piece, turning faith into discipline, compassion into command. They became something the medieval world had never seen before: monks who killed, soldiers who prayed. And for a time, the world worshipped them for it. The Church blessed their cause. The Pope himself granted them privileges no other order had ever received: freedom from taxes, from kings, from bishops. The Templars answered only to God, or rather, to the Pope who claimed to speak for him. That divine authority gave them the power to act above the law, and in doing so, they became a law unto themselves. Their vow of poverty soon twisted into paradox. Though each knight owned nothing, the order itself became wealthier than most kingdoms. Gold poured into their treasuries from Europe to Jerusalem. Lords entrusted them with land, merchants with fortunes, and kings with secrets. Their white mantles, once symbols of purity, now shimmered with influence. And yet, within this rise was the seed of their downfall. For all their discipline, the Templars lived in a world built on contradiction. They preached humility, but they stood beside emperors. They swore obedience, yet their allegiance was to no earthly ruler. They vowed chastity, but rumors whispered that their brotherhood practiced rites of intimacy and devotion that blurred the line between love and loyalty. These were not sins of the flesh, but sins of secrecy, misunderstood by those outside their circle. In the eyes of ordinary men, what could not be seen must surely be dark. In Jerusalem, their fortress stood like a temple within a temple. By day, they rode out under the blazing sun, their white cloaks marked with blood and dust. By night, they prayed in silence, their chants echoing through cold halls where candlelight flickered against the stone. The discipline of their order was absolute. A brother who disobeyed was not merely punished, he was spiritually erased. Confession was not for redemption but for control. Every emotion, every desire, every doubt had to be buried beneath the armor of obedience. To be a Templar was to become an instrument, not a man. The deeper their faith, the more it demanded of them. They began to believe that their battles were not only for Jerusalem, but for the soul of humanity itself. The blood they spilled was not murder, it was purification. And that belief, so absolute, made them dangerous. Because once a man believes his violence is sacred, no mortal power can stop him. To them, the battlefield was a chapel, and every enemy slain was an offering. They lived by the sword not out of cruelty, but conviction. But faith, when mixed with authority, becomes a weapon of its own. The Templars' influence spread across Europe like wildfire. They established vast networks of commanderies, banks, and strongholds. Their red cross became a symbol of divine sanction. Pilgrims trusted them, kings feared them, and peasants whispered that they were more powerful than the church itself. And perhaps, in secret, they were. For power rarely grows without shadow, and the Templars' shadow stretched long over Christendom. Still, beneath the armor and oaths, some knights felt the weight of what they had become. The simplicity of their founding purpose, to protect the innocent, had been swallowed by bureaucracy, gold, and blood. The purity of their calling was now obscured by ambition and ritual. Their vow of poverty had birthed a bank. Their vow of obedience had built an army. Their vow of chastity had inspired rumors of heresy. In every way that mattered, they were drifting from the God they had sworn to serve. The transformation of the Templars mirrored the transformation of faith itself in the Middle Ages. What began as devotion became domination. The Church had unleashed them as holy warriors, but soon realized that what it had created could not easily be controlled. A brotherhood that answered only to divine law would always be a threat to earthly power. And so, what started as a movement of purity was destined to be recast as corruption. For now, though, they were untouchable. The Knights Templar had become both myth and institution, servants of Christ, masters of war, keepers of secrets. Yet beneath every prayer, beneath every victory, the whispers began. That somewhere in the shadows of their ceremonies, something ancient stirred. Something not written in any gospel, but remembered in blood. The vows that once bound them to God were beginning to bind them to something else, something older and far more dangerous. The air in the chamber was heavy, so still that every heartbeat felt like a drumbeat against eternity. A young man, stripped of his name and status, stood barefoot before the altar. Around him, Torches hissed in iron sconces, throwing shadows that trembled like ghosts. 12 knights surrounded him, their faces obscured by hoods, their voices low and unyielding. He had come seeking the light of Christ, but what awaited him was something far darker, a ritual that few outside the order ever witnessed and none survived to tell. They asked him the first question in Latin, "Do you wish to serve God with all that you are?" He nodded. The second, "Will you surrender your will, your wealth, and your soul to the temple?" Another nod. But it was the third question that made the blood freeze in his veins. "Will you submit to all commands, holy or unholy, without question or hesitation?" That was the oath that divided the pious from the damned. To refuse was to be cast out forever. To accept was to belong to the brotherhood of blood and silence. And so, trembling, he whispered yes. A sword touched his shoulder, and the Grand Master recited words few could ever forget. "As your flesh bleeds, so shall your soul be purified." The novice was pricked by the blade, small, deliberate, symbolic. A drop of blood ran down his arm and fell onto the stone floor. The torchlight caught it, turning it into a ruby in the darkness. The blood of the initiate mingled with the stains of countless others who had knelt in the same place before him. This was how a man was reborn, not by baptism in water, but by the offering of blood. To outsiders, the ritual would appear blasphemous. But to the Templars, it was sacred. Blood was not sin, it was covenant. It marked the moment when mortal flesh met divine purpose. Every cut, every wound, was a seal between man and brotherhood, between body and eternity. In a world where life was fragile, blood was the only truth that never lied. There were whispers that during initiation, the Templar novice was made to renounce the symbol of Christ, sometimes even spitting on the cross or treading upon it. To the Church, such acts were unforgivable heresy. Yet in the eyes of the Templars, it was a test of the soul. They believed faith was not proven by worship, but by endurance. To face shame without breaking, that was true obedience. For what good was a knight who could not defy appearances to obey the unseen will of God? The ritual humiliated the body to strengthen the spirit. Some chroniclers spoke of darker things. They claimed the initiate was forced to kiss his superior on the mouth, the navel, even the base of the spine. Ritual gestures said to represent submission, humility, and trust. In medieval minds, this was monstrous. In the logic of the brotherhood, it was symbolic unity, flesh yielding to faith, ego buried beneath devotion. It was a reenactment of death and rebirth, of man surrendering individuality to become part of something greater than himself. The Templars were not interested in purity of appearance. They sought purity of loyalty, something far more dangerous. The ceremony was designed to strip away identity. Once the blood oath was sworn, the man ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. His family, his past, even his name, all gone. He was now a frater militiae Christi, a brother of the military of Christ. His only family was the order. His only law was obedience. And his only truth was silence. The secrets he now carried were not to be spoken even under pain of death. In fact, the fear of death was the very thing the order taught him to destroy within himself. When the initiation ended, the new knight was given his mantle, a white cloak symbolizing purity, its red cross stitched with threads soaked in blood. Some said it was goat's blood, others swore it was human. No record confirms either, but in that moment, it did not matter. The cloak was a shroud and a promise. Purity through suffering, salvation through secrecy. He wore it like armor against the world, and like a chain around his soul. Psychologically, the initiation was a masterwork of control. It broke men down to rebuild them as instruments of absolute loyalty. The fear, the humiliation, the blood, it all served one purpose: to ensure no brother would ever betray another. By enduring pain and secrecy together, they became bound by trauma stronger than any vow of faith. It was the birth of a collective mind, a machine of flesh and spirit that could obey without question, fight without mercy, and die without hesitation. In time, these secret rituals gave rise to whispers that the Templars were not servants of Christ but worshippers of darkness. The Church accused them of demonic ceremonies, of baptizing recruits in blood, of worshipping idols shaped like human heads. Yet perhaps the truth was more disturbing than any legend. The Templars did not worship evil, they simply embraced a truth too terrible for the Church to bear, that faith and violence are twins, and that redemption often demands cruelty. The blood oaths of the Knights Templar were not superstition, they were psychology, centuries ahead of their time. The ritual worked because it reached into the deepest part of the human mind, where fear and faith blur into the same emotion. It turned men into believers who could not be broken, warriors who saw pain as prayer. And in that darkness, they found something the Church never could, power born not of mercy, but of silence. When the torches finally died and the doors closed behind him, the new brother stood alone. The chamber smelled of smoke and blood. He touched his wound and felt it pulse, warm, alive, eternal. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that he would never again belong to the world he had left behind. The order had claimed him, body and soul. And as he stepped into the night, beneath the stars of Jerusalem, he understood what the oath truly meant. His blood was no longer his own. It belonged to the temple. And once given, it could never be taken back. The line between faith and heresy was as thin as a blade's edge, and the Knights Templar walked it every day. They had become legends of both holiness and horror, men of God who prayed before killing, who swore chastity yet shared secret rituals no priest could name. But the deepest fear of the Church was not their power, nor their wealth. It was their secrecy. For what is hidden can be imagined, and what is imagined can be condemned. And so, the whispers began, that the Templars no longer served the Christ of Rome, but a different God, one buried in shadow and silence. The accusations spoke of an idol, Baphomet. The name alone seemed to breathe blasphemy. To the inquisitors, it was proof that the Templars had fallen into devil worship, that behind their prayers and banners they adored a demonic figure, half man, half beast. But what was Baphomet? No one truly knew. The word appeared first in confession transcripts, torn from tortured mouths. Some said it was a corruption of Muhammad, a slur linking them to the Muslim faith. Others believed it was an ancient name, older than Christianity, the remnant of a secret god the Templars had uncovered in the East. In the ruins of the Holy Land, the Templars had seen things the Church could not understand: Islamic mysticism, Hebrew Kabbalah, Gnostic fragments thought long destroyed. They collected relics, manuscripts, and symbols not for power, but for knowledge. To them, truth was sacred, even if it lay outside dogma. The Church, however, saw such curiosity as corruption. Knowledge that did not serve Rome was knowledge that served the devil. And when the Templars began to speak of the divine light within man, of the duality of God as both creator and destroyer, they were no longer soldiers of Christ. They were heretics. The idea of the hidden God haunted the Church's imagination. The Templars were said to keep a human head, embalmed or metallic, that they worshipped in secret. Witnesses described it as a bearded man's face, serene and terrible. Some said it could speak, others that it glowed in darkness. The Inquisitors called it an idol, the Templars called it a symbol. Modern historians suspect it may have represented the head of John the Baptist, an image of prophecy and sacrifice, not heresy. Yet, to the medieval mind, anything mysterious was monstrous. The Church needed no proof, only fear. But beneath the hysteria, a subtler truth may have existed. The Templars, shaped by war and mysticism, had come to see divinity not as a distant ruler, but as a force within every man. They had fought and bled in the name of a God who demanded cruelty for salvation. To survive such paradox, they redefined holiness itself. Their rituals, their secrecy, even their silence, all served a spiritual vision too dangerous for orthodoxy. The Templar faith may have been an early form of esoteric Christianity, a belief that the divine could only be found through knowledge, suffering, and inner illumination, not through the hierarchy of priests. Imagine their prayers in those hidden chambers, not to a devil, but to the God within, the God that bleeds and burns and is reborn. To the Church, such theology was blasphemy. To the Templars, it was truth. The idol, whatever its shape, may have symbolized that truth, a mirror of man's divinity, an image of the God they carried in their hearts. Yet in the language of fear, mirrors become monsters. The Church took their metaphors for demons and their silence for guilt. Psychologically, the heresy of the Templars reveals something universal about power. Institutions fear what they cannot control. The Church ruled through visibility, sermons, rituals, spectacle. The Templars ruled through silence. Their strength came from mystery, from the unspoken bond between men who shared what no outsider could comprehend. The Church could not compete with that. To break the Templars, it had to make their secrecy appear evil. By turning their hidden god into a devil, the Church reclaimed the narrative of holiness. Still, one question lingers through the centuries. Why did the Templars not deny it? Even under threat of torture, many remained silent. Perhaps because what they had found in their secrecy was more sacred than life itself. Perhaps they knew that the truth of their faith was beyond words, and that to explain it to those who sought only to destroy it would be to profane it. In a way, their silence was not confession but defiance. A final act of loyalty to the God the Church could never understand. The tragedy of the Templars lies not in what they believed, but in what the world believed about them. The Church saw heretics, the people saw sorcerers, kings saw rivals. But behind the veil of accusation, there may have been a vision, one that sought to reconcile the light and the darkness within man, to find God not above the world but within its shadows. It was a faith too fragile for an age ruled by fear, and too dangerous for an institution built on control. And so, the legend of Baphomet became the symbol of forbidden truth. The Church burned the idols, the scrolls, the men, but could not burn the idea that somewhere beneath the surface of dogma lies a deeper faith, one that does not fear the darkness but learns from it. The Knights Templar may have been destroyed, but the mystery they carried, the heresy of the hidden God, survived in whispers, in symbols, in secret brotherhoods that would rise again in centuries to come. Faith had birthed power, power had birthed secrecy, and secrecy, at last, had birthed heresy. The Church thought it had buried their God forever. But in the hidden corners of history, the Templars' forbidden creed still breathes, half prayer, half rebellion, waiting for the day the world dares to listen again. The chamber of vows had long grown cold, but the echoes of what happened within it lived on in the flesh of those who swore the blood oath. What began as a ritual of faith became a covenant of endurance, one that demanded not belief, but sacrifice. The Templars were soldiers, but they were also penitents. Every wound was prayer. Every drop of blood spilled in war or in ritual was part of a debt they owed to both God and brotherhood. In the Order's mind, loyalty was not tested by words or gold, but by how much pain a man could bear for his oath. To be a Knight Templar was to live with the constant reminder that the body was nothing but a vessel for obedience. They fasted until they hallucinated, scourged themselves until their skin broke, and confessed until they no longer knew the difference between sin and duty. But beneath this surface of holy suffering, there existed rituals darker and more secret than even their initiations, ceremonies designed to fuse faith with flesh, to make loyalty something that could be felt beneath the skin. They called it purification, but to the Church it would look like blasphemy. In some accounts preserved from inquisitorial interrogations, the Templars were accused of drawing blood during their vows and using it in sacred communion. Whether true or not, the image of knights drinking from a chalice of blood haunted the imagination of Europe. To their accusers, it was proof of devilry. To the Templars, it may have been metaphor, a symbolic reminder that service to God required the sacrifice of self. But even a metaphor, when wrapped in secrecy, becomes a weapon for those eager to destroy. Pain, to the Templars, was a form of enlightenment. It cleansed the mind of distraction and the body of sin. Many knights practiced flagellation in solitude, believing that through the lash they could share in the suffering of Christ. Others carried small iron chains under their garments, pressing into their flesh with every movement, a constant reminder of their vow. There are writings from chroniclers who describe Templars returning from battle covered in wounds, refusing medical care, insisting that the scars were blessings. Each cut, they believed, brought them closer to understanding divine endurance. Yet the Brotherhood's obsession with blood and pain had another purpose, one far more psychological. In their world, fear was the enemy. To obey without hesitation, A man had to first conquer the instinct to protect himself. The order's secret rituals, often misinterpreted as sadistic, were in fact tools of conditioning. They broke the human reflex for self-preservation. By teaching men to accept suffering, the Templars created warriors who no longer feared death. To the church, they were zealots. To each other, they were purified souls, flesh transformed into weapon. Some testimonies tell of trials of the body, tests meant to prove the depth of one's devotion. A knight might be forced to stand motionless for hours while his brothers recited oaths over him. Others endured simulated executions, blindfolded, believing the next heartbeat would be their last. Some were buried up to the neck in sand and left beneath the burning sun to meditate on the fragility of life. Such rituals were brutal, but they served a purpose: to make death familiar, to make fear obsolete. Only then could a man fight as the Templars did, with perfect calm, as if already dead. But this obsession with physical endurance had a cost. Over time, it distorted their understanding of holiness. They began to equate pain with purity, and loyalty with submission. The stronger their unity grew, the more dangerous it became. Because when men learned to silence pain, they also learned to silence conscience. The Templars' capacity for violence, sanctified by faith, became limitless. On the battlefield, they were angels of death, unflinching, unmerciful. In their minds, killing was not cruelty, it was obedience. Still, not all Templars embraced this darkness without question. Some struggled in silence. Imagine a young knight, fresh from his initiation, witnessing his brothers whip themselves until blood streaked the stone floor. He feels both awe and terror, wondering if this is what holiness truly means. In his dreams, he sees Christ not as Savior but as a wounded man, bleeding endlessly, never healed. That was the paradox of their faith: to imitate divine suffering without ever finding peace. The Church's records claim the Templars confessed to obscene and perverse rituals. But history, stripped of hysteria, reveals a subtler truth. Their so-called depravity was not lust. It was devotion taken to its most terrifying extreme. They had transformed faith into an endurance test, love into discipline, and brotherhood into bondage. Every act of pain shared among them was a reminder that they belonged to something greater than themselves. And when the world began to turn against them, these bonds, sealed in blood, would prove unbreakable. By the late 13th century, their secret rituals had become inseparable from their identity. The Templars no longer feared judgment because they believed their suffering justified all things. To endure was to be chosen. To bleed was to be blessed. They saw themselves as martyrs before death, already redeemed through the purity of their oaths. But to the Church, that arrogance was intolerable. The line between sacrifice and sin had been crossed. The Templars' blood rituals were now seen not as holy devotion, but as evidence of a cult that had strayed into darkness. And yet, from a modern eye, there is something profoundly human in their madness. The need to belong, to prove loyalty, to suffer for meaning. These are not relics of medieval minds. They are echoes of the same instincts that drive soldiers, zealots, and believers across every age. The Templars' blood oaths were not just about power, they were about purpose. In a world ruled by violence and faith, they sought a way to merge the two, to make pain sacred and death divine. As the years darkened toward their fall, the Brothers of the Temple clung tighter to these forbidden rites. They believed the world could strip them of their castles, their gold, even their lives, but not their vows. The blood had been spilled, the pact was eternal. What began as an oath of purity had become a covenant of flesh. The Church would one day burn their bodies, but their belief, that salvation must be earned through suffering, would outlive the flames. For in the heart of every man who has ever bled for faith, the ghost of the Templar oath still stirs, whispering that true loyalty demands a price no one else is willing to pay. The beginning of the end came quietly, like a rumor, like a chill creeping through the corridors of the temple. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had been untouchable. They had fought for Christ, bled for kings, and built a network of wealth and knowledge that stretched from Jerusalem to Paris. But the world was changing. The Crusades had failed. The Holy Land was lost. The age of faith was collapsing beneath the weight of greed, and in the dying light of Christendom, a king's envy would set the temple ablaze. It began with Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, a man whose beauty masked a mind of ice. France was drowning in debt, and the Templars were among his creditors. Their fortress in Paris stood not far from his palace, its treasury guarded by silent brothers whose loyalty was only to God. Philip's kingdom was crumbling, his coffers empty. And so, he turned his gaze toward the one power that could not be bought or bribed, the Templars. To destroy them, he would need more than armies. He would need a lie. Philip's weapon was accusation. He whispered to the Pope that the Templars practiced heresy, that they spat upon the cross, worshipped idols, and defiled holy sacraments. He claimed their secret rites were acts of the devil, their silence proof of guilt. At first, the Pope hesitated. The Templars were his knights, the Church's sword. But politics has no loyalty, only convenience. Pope Clement V, a Frenchman himself, owed his throne to Philip. And so, with a single letter sealed in wax, the Pope turned his back on the very order that had built the Church's empire. The dawn of October 13, 1307, Friday the 13th, became a day cursed in history. Across France, as church bells tolled the morning hour, Philip's soldiers struck. Doors were smashed open. Knights were dragged from their beds, shackled, beaten, their red crosses torn from their cloaks. In Paris alone, hundreds were taken. The mighty order that had once protected kings now found itself hunted like criminals. The raids were swift, methodical, absolute. It was not a battle, it was an extermination. The Church announced that the arrests were righteous, that the knights had confessed to abominations beyond imagining. But in truth, the confessions had already been written before the arrests began. The Templars' enemies had prepared their guilt in advance. Under threat of torture, the knights were forced to sign their own damnation. The accusations spread like plague, that they denied Christ, that they kissed demons, that they worshipped a goat-headed idol. The more grotesque the charge, the more believable it became. The world did not question the absurdity, it only hungered for scandal. For the first time, the Templars' most sacred vow, the vow of silence, became their undoing. Bound by oath not to reveal their inner rituals, they refused to defend themselves. To speak of the ceremonies was to betray the order, even in death. Their devotion, once their greatest strength, now condemned them. The Church demanded confession, the brothers offered only silence. To the inquisitors, silence was the language of guilt. Behind the stone walls of their prisons, the Templars endured torments designed to shatter the body and the soul. They were stretched on racks until their bones cracked, their joints torn apart. They were scorched with fire, drowned in water, and mutilated until words of confession spilled from broken lips. But even those who confessed retracted their words once the torture stopped. Some declared, through swollen tongues and bleeding mouths, that they had lied to please their tormentors. Yet by then, the Church had all it needed: a record of sin, a reason to burn. The betrayal ran deeper than politics. The fall of the Templars marked the end of an age, the death of the medieval dream that faith could exist without corruption. The Church, once their ally, had devoured its own creation. Philip wanted gold, but what he destroyed was something far older and far more sacred, a brotherhood that had lived for a vision beyond kingdoms. In their downfall, the Templars revealed the truth about power, that even holy institutions feed on blood when threatened. The people of Europe watched in horror and fascination. How could God's own knights be accused of worshipping the devil? How could the most loyal servants of Christ be branded heretics? But in the eyes of the Church, no man was too holy to burn. And so, the narrative was rewritten. The Templars became villains in a story authored by kings. Their silence became conspiracy, their discipline became arrogance, their secrecy became sin. Imagine the fear in those final days, the clang of iron doors, the stench of damp stone, the distant cries of brothers being questioned. Some prayed. Others sat in silence, staring at the crucifix carved into the wall, wondering how the faith they had defended had become their executioner. The irony was unbearable. They had once killed for the Church, now they would die by it. Yet even as they awaited judgment, many refused to speak. Their loyalty was unbreakable. They had taken an oath to protect the secrets of the temple, and even in chains, they kept it. What Philip could not understand, what no inquisitor could comprehend, was that the Templars' true strength was never their wealth or their fortresses. It was their belief. They had built their identity around pain, sacrifice, and devotion. Torture could not destroy what had already been embraced. When the Church inflicted agony upon them, the Knights did not see it as punishment. They saw it as confirmation that their suffering was the final test of faith. Thus, their destruction became their sanctification. The more they were humiliated, the more sacred they became in the eyes of those who remembered their deeds. Legends began to grow in secret, that the Templars had hidden their treasures before the arrests, that their Grand Master had cursed the Pope and the King as he died, that their knowledge, their relics, their bloodlines had survived. Out of their ashes, myth was born. The fall of the Templars was not only a political execution, it was a spiritual crucifixion. The Church had created a brotherhood of perfect soldiers and then condemned them for their perfection. Their silence, once holy, was now painted as guilt. Their courage, once divine, was recast as pride. But in truth, what terrified the Church was not heresy, it was freedom. The Templars had lived by their own vision of God, a vision that did not need Rome. And in a world ruled by thrones and altars, that was the greatest sin of all. As the flames of accusation spread through Europe, a new kind of darkness fell, a silence not of obedience, but of erasure. Records were destroyed, names vanished, and the brotherhood that had once commanded armies now existed only in rumor. Yet even as the world turned its back on them, the oath remained. In forgotten prisons and execution squares, the last Templars whispered their final prayers, not for salvation, but for vengeance. And though their bodies would burn, their words would linger, like smoke rising toward a heaven that no longer seemed to care. Faith had made them holy. Power had made them untouchable. But betrayal made them immortal. The smell of smoke clung to the walls of every dungeon that held them. The screams had long since faded into whispers, yet the silence that followed was worse. In the damp, candlelit chambers of the Inquisition, the Knights of the Temple faced their final trial, not by sword or on the battlefield, but by fire, rope, and water. For 2 centuries they had conquered fear. Now, fear itself became their judge. Torture was the language of truth in that age, and the inquisitors spoke it fluently. The first to break were not cowards, but men of flesh. They were bound hand and foot, their limbs pulled until bones cracked like dry wood. Some were lowered slowly into vats of boiling oil or stretched on racks until their spines tore. The Church called these methods purgations corporis, purifications of the body. In reality, they were mutilations of the soul. The inquisitors did not seek truth, they sought affirmation. They already knew the story they wanted told, that the Templars had consorted with the devil, kissed idols, and spat upon Christ. All that remained was to make their victims say it aloud. Under torment, the line between confession and survival dissolved. A man hanging by his arms for hours would say anything to make the pain stop. And so, the confessions began to flow. Some claimed they had denied Christ at initiation. Others said they had worshipped a bearded head that whispered prophecies. There were even tales of secret kisses and blood rites, recited in trembling voices before men who smiled as they wrote it all down. Each confession was a nail in the coffin of the order. Each word, forced through agony, became evidence against them. But the deeper horror was psychological. Torture does not only wound the body, it reshapes the mind. The Templars, conditioned their entire lives to equate pain with faith, were especially vulnerable. To them, suffering was sacred. When the inquisitors broke their bones, they did not see it as punishment, but as another trial from God. Some believed they were being tested, that their endurance would redeem the brotherhood. Others began to question whether they had, in fact, sinned, whether their silence had hidden blasphemy too long. Under torture, memory bends, faith collapses, and guilt becomes inevitable. The Church took advantage of this psychological torment with precision. A man who denied his guilt was tortured until he confessed. A man who confessed was told that repentance required him to implicate others. No answer could save them, Every path led to ruin. The Inquisitors called this mercy, the salvation of souls through suffering. But there was no mercy, only spectacle. The sight of knights weeping and broken before their captors served as proof that even the most holy could fall. It was propaganda written in blood. Outside the walls, rumors spread faster than truth. The people, who had once revered the Templars as heroes, now spoke of them as demons. They whispered that the knights had made pacts with Satan, that they performed obscene rites under moonlight. The spectacle of public confessions turned the once sacred brotherhood into monsters. And in that transformation, the Church found power. The fall of the Templars became a sermon, a warning to all who might hide their faith from authority. Yet even amid the despair, sparks of defiance flickered. Some knights refused to speak, no matter the pain. They bit through their tongues to avoid uttering a single false word. Others endured the rack in silence until their hearts stopped. To their captors, they were stubborn heretics. But to those who remembered them, they were martyrs of conscience, men who chose truth over life. Their agony became legend, their silence a final prayer. The contrast between their torment and their faith reveals something terrible about the human condition. We are creatures who can sanctify cruelty in the name of righteousness. The Inquisitors believed they were purifying souls through pain, while the Templars believed they were sanctifying their suffering through endurance. Two sides of the same madness. Both convinced God stood with them. The torture chambers became altars where morality itself was flayed alive. Among the many confessions recorded, there are glimpses of the men behind the myth. One night, Geoffrey de Gonneville said softly through broken teeth, "We did no evil, only what we were commanded." Another, Amory de Villiers, confessed to acts he never committed, then retracted his words in tears, begging forgiveness from God for lying. Their statements reveal not guilt, but exhaustion, the collapse of men crushed between obedience and damnation. The Pope, trapped between politics and conscience, watched the horror unfold from afar. Clement V knew the confessions were born of torture, yet he lacked the courage to oppose the king who had made him. In the end, he sanctioned the trials, preferring complicity to chaos. Thus, the Church became both executioner and absolver, blessing the flames that would soon consume its own warriors. In 1310, 54 Templars were marched to the fields outside Paris and burned alive. Witnesses said they went to the stake singing psalms, their voices unbroken even as the fire took them. The chroniclers wrote that the smell of burning flesh mingled with the scent of incense, as if heaven and hell had conspired to meet in that moment. One by one, the knights fell silent, but their eyes, described by onlookers as clear and defiant, haunted those who watched. Torture had done its work. The order was broken. The confessions, the flames, the ashes, all of it became the official truth. Yet the Inquisitors, for all their triumph, could not extinguish what they feared most, the myth. The blood-soaked legends of the Templars' endurance spread across Europe. Some said the knights had cursed the Pope and King Philip from the flames, prophesying that both would soon face divine judgment. Within a year, both were dead. Coincidence or curse, history does not say, but the people believed. The Inquisition had turned men into symbols, but symbols have a way of surviving their creators. The Templars' torture and confessions became more than a tragedy. They became scripture in reverse, a tale of faith twisted, purity betrayed, and silence exalted. Every lash of the whip, every groan of the rack, became part of their canon, written not in ink but in pain. And so, what the Church thought it destroyed, it had instead immortalized. The Templars' endurance under torture became the proof of their sanctity. Their refusal to renounce the brotherhood even in agony became the ultimate act of defiance. They died with the same vow they had lived by, secrecy unto death. In their torment, they found transcendence. The fire that devoured their flesh only forged their legend. The Church believed it had purged heresy from the world. But in the smoke that rose from those pyres, a different truth ascended, one that no torture could silence. The Templars had turned pain into prayer, death into victory, and silence into immortality. And as the embers faded into the night sky, it was no longer the Inquisitors who held power, but the ghosts of the knights who would never speak again. The flames of betrayal burned for years before the final spark fell upon the last Grand Master. Jacques de Molay was not merely a man. He was the living symbol of everything the Templars had been: devotion, discipline, and unbreakable silence. By the time he was dragged before the tribunal, his brothers were scattered, his order dissolved, and his name already written in the Book of the Damned. Yet when the Church demanded confession, when kings demanded apology, de Molay stood as if carved from stone. His eyes, witnesses said, carried the calm of a man who had already died 100 times before. He had endured years of imprisonment in darkness, watching his brothers vanish one by one into the fires of execution. The inquisitors came again and again, offering mercy for obedience, salvation for betrayal. He refused them all. In their eyes, this was arrogance. In truth, it was the final vow, the vow that no pain, no power, no lie could make him forsake what he had sworn to protect. To the Church, his silence was defiance. To his brothers, wherever they still lived, it was a benediction. On March 18, 1314, the Grand Master was led out to the Isle de la Cite in Paris, where 2 pyres waited beside the Seine. The air was cold, the river dark, and the crowd restless. De Molay was stripped of his white cloak and chained to the stake. Around him stood the executioners of both faith and monarchy, the Pope's envoys, the king's guards, and the silent priests who had once blessed his sword. Before the fire was lit, he was given one last chance to save himself. The herald read aloud his crimes: heresy, idolatry, and the worship of the devil. De Molay's voice, thin but unwavering, cut through the wind. God knows who is wrong and who has sinned. Soon misfortune will fall upon those who have condemned us. I summon you, Pope Clement, and you, King Philip, to appear before God's tribunal within a year. The crowd gasped. Some priests crossed themselves. It was not a plea. It was a curse. And as the torch touched the wood, the final vow of the Knights Templar was fulfilled, not in secrecy, but in fire. The witnesses wrote that he did not scream. He stood still, the flames licking up his body, the smoke rising into the night like incense. His last words were prayers. To the Church, it was the end of heresy. To history, it was the birth of legend. Within a month, Pope Clement V was dead. Within a year, so was Philip IV. Whether coincidence or divine reckoning, the prophecy of the burning Templar became the foundation of an eternal myth, that God himself had avenged the brotherhood. In that moment, the true nature of their silence was revealed. For centuries, the Templars had guarded their secrets with vows sealed in blood. But their final silence, the refusal to confess, to plead, to explain, was something greater than secrecy. It was transcendence. When speech became weaponized by power, silence became the last form of truth. De Molay's death transformed silence into sanctity, making it clear that the order's legacy would not die with its last master. Those who watched the execution whispered that as the flames consumed him, the wind carried a sound like chanting, hundreds of voices murmuring beneath the crackle of fire. Some said it was imagination. Others believed that in that instant every Templar who had ever taken the oath was present, their spirits bound together in defiance. The blood oaths that had once joined them in life had now become immortal. The Church tried to erase the memory of that night. The ashes of the Grand Master were thrown into the Seine, his name struck from every record. Yet legends have a way of clinging to silence. In taverns and monasteries, travelers whispered of secret Templars who escaped across the sea, of hidden treasures and hidden truths. The symbol of the Red Cross reappeared in strange places, carved into chapel walls, woven into noble seals, painted into manuscripts no priest would approve. What was meant to be forgotten had only been made mysterious. The deeper truth of their end lies not in politics but in psychology. The Templars' final vow, silence, was not cowardice, but control. It was a spiritual weapon more powerful than the sword. In a world built on confession and obedience, to say nothing was to claim ownership of one's soul. Torture could shatter bones, fire could devour flesh, but silence was invincible. It denied the oppressors their victory. It turned martyrdom into mastery. De Molay did not die begging for mercy. He died guarding a secret the Church could never take. Historians argue whether the Templars were innocent or guilty, whether their hidden rites were truth or rumor. But such debates miss the point. What mattered was not what they believed, but what they refused to reveal. The power of a secret lies not in its content, but in its protection. The Templars understood this better than anyone. Their final silence became the ultimate expression of faith, not in the Church, not in the Pope, but in their own covenant with God. In the centuries that followed, silence became their afterlife. The order's memory evolved into a symbol of rebellion against religious tyranny, of the human spirit resisting corruption. Their curse upon the Pope and the King echoed through generations as a story of justice divine and unseen. Secret societies arose in their name, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and countless others, each claiming descent from that ancient brotherhood of secrecy and sacrifice. Whether myth or inheritance, all were drawn to the same allure, the sacred power of the unspoken. Imagine the embers of that final pyre drifting down into the Seine, glowing briefly before sinking beneath the black water. For the witnesses, it was an ending. But for history, it was a beginning. The Grand Master's last breath became the spark that lit centuries of fascination and fear. Every secret order, every whisper of hidden knowledge, every rebellion against spiritual authority would trace its bloodline back to that night. When the Church tried to bury them, the Templars became eternal. When kings tried to silence them, they became immortal. And when Jacques de Molay's voice vanished into smoke, his words remained, that truth cannot burn, and vows written in blood do not die. The death of the Templars was not the destruction of a brotherhood, it was the birth of a legend. They had been soldiers, priests, sinners, and saints. But in their final vow, they became something far more enduring, the embodiment of human defiance in the face of absolute power. The silence they left behind was not absence, it was echo. And even now, when the night is still and the world forgets, that echo lingers, like the faint toll of a bell that refuses to fade. The ashes of the Templars sank into the cold waters of the Seine, but the fire that consumed them never truly died. In the centuries that followed, that flame spread across time, unseen, unstoppable, whispering through history like a ghost that refused to rest. What the Church thought it had buried in smoke and silence became a seed, and from that seed grew one of humanity's most enduring obsessions, the idea that somewhere beneath faith lies forbidden truth. The Church had written its version of the story. Officially, the Knights Templar were heretics, arrogant soldiers who defied divine law and paid the price. Their name was erased from records, their property seized, their symbols forbidden. Yet erasure is never perfect. The very act of destruction gave them immortality. The world, curious and untrusting, began to ask why such holy warriors had been damned so completely. Why had the Church feared them enough to destroy them? What secret was worth all that blood? In the silence that followed, myths began to bloom. Some said the Templars had unearthed relics too powerful for mortal hands, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or even the bones of Christ himself. Others whispered that they had discovered truths buried beneath Jerusalem, truths that could unmake the Church's authority. There were rumors of secret scrolls, of ancient oaths that connected them to older faiths, older gods. In these tales, the Templars became something more than knights. They became keepers of humanity's lost knowledge, guardians of what the Church dared not reveal. But beyond relics and conspiracies, the Templar legend survived for a deeper reason. It spoke to something within the human soul, the longing for hidden meaning, for a truth beyond power. Their story became a mirror through which every age saw its own reflection. To the Renaissance thinkers, they were martyrs of knowledge. To the Enlightenment philosophers, they were symbols of freedom against tyranny. To the secret societies of the 18th and 19th centuries, they were the spiritual ancestors of resistance itself, men who died for truth in a world ruled by lies. The Red Cross of the Temple, once a mark of faith, transformed into a symbol of forbidden enlightenment. It appeared carved into cathedrals, etched in the architecture of Freemasonic lodges, hidden in art, literature, and the dreams of those who believed knowledge could make men divine. The Church's attempt to erase the Templars only scattered their ashes into the air, and those ashes took root in imagination. Even today, The name Templar carries an aura of awe and unease, a reminder of how thin the line is between holiness and heresy. Yet their legacy is not just myth. Beneath the legends lies a psychological truth, one that still defines humanity. The Templars' story is the story of devotion corrupted by power, of faith tested beyond endurance. It reveals the paradox at the heart of belief, that the pursuit of the divine can lead men to both glory and madness. The blood oaths that once bound them did not only belong to the 12th century, they echo in every ideology, every cult, every army that swears its cause is sacred. The Templar oath was not just medieval ritual, it was the first draft of every blind allegiance that followed. And yet, there is something undeniably noble in their tragedy. The Templars lived in a world that demanded absolute conviction, and they gave it everything. Their silence, their pain, their deaths, all were acts of faith. Whether they were right or wrong is irrelevant. What endures is their refusal to bow. In a time when obedience was survival, they chose defiance. In a world ruled by crowns and crosses, they chose their own God, one too vast, too silent, too personal to be confined by any church. Centuries later, as empires rose and fell, their legend only grew stronger. The Enlightenment turned them into symbols of forbidden knowledge. The Romantics transformed them into tragic heroes. Modern conspiracies resurrected them as architects of secret world orders. The irony is that every generation remade them in its own image. Knights of darkness, saints of rebellion, prophets of truth. The Templars had become what the Church could never destroy. A living myth, adaptable and immortal. But perhaps the true power of their legacy lies not in the myths, but in the questions they left behind. What does it mean to serve faith when faith becomes power? What happens when loyalty demands silence against conscience? And how far will a man go to defend a truth he cannot prove? These questions haunted the medieval world, and they still haunt ours. For in the Templar story, we see both the beauty and the horror of devotion. They remind us that belief, when stripped of doubt, can sanctify even cruelty, but also that in the ruins of every betrayal, something eternal still endures, the human hunger for meaning. Imagine, for a moment, that river in Paris centuries ago. The wind is cold, the night silent. The ashes of Jacques de Molay drift upon the black water, mingling with the reflections of the city's torches. Somewhere, a monk writes the official decree that ends the order forever. But in the quiet that follows, another sound rises, not from the earth, but from memory, the echo of oaths whispered in stone halls, the rhythm of blood dripping onto sacred ground. That sound is the pulse of the legend itself, the heartbeat of a secret that refused to die. History would move on. The church would fracture, kingdoms would fall, and faith itself would evolve. But the Templars' story remains, half history, half haunting, because it touches something primal in us all. It is the story of every soul that sought God and found darkness, every believer who dared to question what holiness truly meant. It is the story of loyalty stronger than life, of silence more powerful than truth. And so, as the centuries pass, the legend endures not because of what they did, but because of what they represent. The Knights Templar are not merely relics of a lost crusade. They are the eternal reflection of humanity's struggle between light and shadow. Their blood oaths, sealed in faith and fear, remind us that truth has always come at a cost. The church buried their bones, but could never bury their question. The question that still burns quietly within every believer, every skeptic, every seeker of hidden truth. If faith demands blindness, is the darkness divine? The world may have forgotten their faces, but not their silence. It lingers, in the symbols carved into stone, in the stories whispered around firelight, in the restless need to uncover what was forbidden. The Templars are gone, but their legacy remains like a scar on the soul of history, beautiful, terrible, and eternal. Their fire still burns.